and she... Great. Good evening. I'm Paul Carice. I'm the director of this new school at Arizona State University. We're starting our third year, the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. Delighted that all of you are here for the second event in our series this year. The larger project we refer to as the Civic Discourse Project, now in its third year. Each year we have a theme, and the theme for this year is Citizenship and Civic Leadership in America. As you can see, once again, we are partnering with Arizona PBS, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. We are glad to be co-sponsoring this third year, along with our first 2 years, with two other ASU partners, the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication and the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. We're also happy, as I said, to be working with Arizona PBS. They produce their own series based on major speakers that we have in the Civic Discourse Project. They produce their own episodes, and they air on Channel 8 locally. Then they archive them on the Arizona PBS website. And you can also find archived video of all of our speaker events in these major speaker series, sessions, and also our annual Constitution Day lecture, our annual Martin Luther King Day lecture. All that's available on the video archive on the school's website. On the theme of civic discourse, I'm happy to say that we have some local and Arizona civic leaders with us tonight, including two members of the state legislature, one from each party, and we have one member of the Board of Regents with us this evening. We also have, I can see in the audience, faculty and staff from other units at ASU, and we're always glad to see as many students as we have. The school has worked for 3 years now to convene a high-level civil discourse on important themes in American society and in higher education. We sometimes have single speakers, sometimes, as tonight, we have dialogue events. We have an annual conference in February. Across all of that, we try to encompass a range of important views. We hope you will spread the word about those efforts and also spread the word about the school's academic program. We're in our third year, but we do have an undergraduate major, undergraduate minor. We are in process with a master's degree. The theme of all of this, as I mentioned, is intellectual diversity and civil disagreement across diverse viewpoints. The president of the university gave us this mission to assemble every year speakers from a range of viewpoints, public intellectuals, scholars, to address important civic and scholarly themes. The events like tonight, where we have two speakers who agree to share the stage, gives us a particularly strong model or example of civil disagreement. One more word about the school's civic education efforts and an important announcement that we have. We're delighted to be able to make tonight. At our last event last week, which was the first event in the series, we announced that there were members of our National Board of Counselors, which is a group of experienced civic and political leaders co-chaired by former Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, and former Arizona U.S. Senator John Kyle. We also have, our speakers might be interested to know, also on that advisory board, Donald Graham, the former publisher of the Washington Post, and Rich Lowry, the current editor of National Review. They advise us on two important themes. One, the theme you're encountering here tonight, civil discourse and civil disagreement, and the other theme is civic education. So before I introduce our two guests, just very good news we are able to announce tonight about our civic education efforts. The National Endowment for the Humanities and the U.S. Department of Education will make an announcement later this week about awardees for a national grant on U.S. history and civics education. It's an almost $700,000 grant across 18 months to study the current state of civics education and to suggest reforms. So just between us, because the NEH hasn't made the formal press release announcement yet, just between us, they will announce that 4 institutions, a team, received the grant: the Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University, the Center for Civic Learning and Engagement at Tufts University, iCivics in Massachusetts, and at ASU, the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. We were awarded the grant. And as part of that grant, in March of 2020, we will host a major convening of federal officials, scholars, teachers about civic education and U.S. history education as part of the process of drafting the final report. So, if our 2 guests are wondering why we asked 2 prominent opinion journalists to come and talk to us about civic education and citizen education and civil discourse, it's because we're knee-deep in it and think it's very important. They have agreed to share the stage and even to be subject to my very hostile and aggressive questioning. So at least they can be models of civil disagreement no matter what I do on the stage. And at this point, I would normally introduce them, but Arizona PBS has asked me to make a pause and do a formal introduction that they can use for the broadcast version, and then I will invite our guests onto the stage. We are delighted they are here, and they've agreed to speak on the theme of citizenship and the media, a responsibility to promote civic literacy. And at this point, I will pause to do the formal intro. Welcome to the first episode of our annual lecture series entitled The Civic Discourse Project, where we are addressing the pressing issues of our time. I'm Paul Carisse, the director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. And this season of the Civic Discourse Project focuses on the theme of citizenship and civic leadership in America. It has the goal of identifying the ingredients necessary for both civic literacy and informed citizenship participation. And it's my pleasure this evening to welcome our 2 distinguished guest speakers, Ramesh Ponnuru from the American Enterprise Institute and the National Review, and David Leonhardt of the New York Times. Okay, just a little bit more introduction from me. I'll be done by midnight, I promise. Now I get to tell you a little bit of brief bio for each of these distinguished guests. I'll start with David Leonhardt. He is an op-ed columnist for the New York Times. He also writes a daily email newsletter for the Times and co-hosts the opinion section's weekly podcast called The Argument. His prior assignment at the New York Times was leading a strategy group that helped the Times leadership to shape the future of the newsroom. He's been with the New York Times for 20 years, having joined in 1999 as a business reporter. He's also been the Washington bureau chief, the founding editor of the Times daily analysis feature called The Upshot, and a staff writer for the Times Magazine. In 2011, he received the Pulitzer Prize for commentary for columns on the financial crisis. Ramesh Ponnuru is a senior editor at National Review, where he's covered national politics and policy for 20 years, more than 20 years. He's also a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, which syndicates his articles in newspapers nationally. He's a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and he serves as a contributing editor to National Affairs, the quarterly journal of conservative ideas. His writing regularly appears in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post. In 2013, he was a resident fellow at the University of Chicago, their Institute of Politics. And in 2015, he was included in the Politico 50, their list of thinkers, doers, and dreamers who matter in American politics. So the format that David and Ramesh have agreed to is that they'll each make brief opening remarks, and then I will pose some follow-up questions. In part 2 of the evening, Arizona PBS will bring back the microphone to the center aisle, and we will have plenty of time for questions from the audience. We invite everyone to stay for reception afterward. And so it wasn't quite a coin toss earlier. Ramesh just offered to let David go first. So thank you both of you for joining us. And David, your opening remarks.
Wonderful. Thanks for having us. It's great to see you all here. And it's nice to be up on stage with Ramesh. Thank you for that nice introduction, Paul. I'll be fairly brief. I think this idea of civil discourse is an important idea, and I think it's important to focus on both of the words there. So obviously, I'm in favor of the civil part of civil discourse, and I'll get to that in a second. But I think it's also important to think about what the discourse part means, that it's okay for us to disagree. It's okay for us to passionately disagree. It's okay to have debates that feel like they're existential to our values and even to the country. That is the way the United States has worked since even before its founding. And if you go back through history, you see all kinds of extremely passionate debates because it matters, right? We're in a democracy where we are supposed to be setting the course for our country's future, and so of course we should argue with each other. And I don't think we should paper that over or pretend that the answer is always to go halfway between two arguments or sand off the rough edges, that we want discourse, we want real debate. And it's okay if it's difficult. That part we seem to be pretty good at right now, right? We're good at disagreeing with each other, with thinking that the issues are serious, with being passionate about it. I do think it's the civil part that we often need more work in. And I'm reminded of a great story about Teddy Kennedy, which is after the defeat of comprehensive immigration reform, there was a gathering of all the people from the left who were pushing for it. Kennedy had been one of the people who'd been in favor of taking a quarter of a loaf or half a loaf when there was a possibility of getting an immigration bill that moved things a little bit of the way. And many other people said, no, we can go further, we can get more, or this can be a bipartisan bill. And in the end, of course, as many of you know, the effort failed. Kennedy's judgment had been right. The people who wanted to try to get more had been wrong. And it would have been very easy to imagine him being bitter about this or offering, I told you so. And instead, when it was all over and there was a gathering of them, he got up and he gave a toast to encouraging people to enjoy the fight, to understand that even when you lose, politics is noble and you have to enjoy even the parts where you lose. And I think there's a version of that we all need to think about just a little bit more, right? Which is that we are lucky to live in a society where we can help shape our future, and we should revel in that rather than viewing it always as something to be angry about. And my small bits of suggestion for doing that are, one, think of an issue where your views are a little bit different from other people who normally agree with you. So if you're conservative, try to think of an issue where you're a little more centrist or a little more liberal. If you're on the left half of the spectrum, as I am, think about issues in which you're more toward the center or even conservative. I'm happy to talk about some examples for myself as the conversation goes on. And then try to read some of the people who you normally disagree with, but on this issue you agree with, or listen to them on the radio or on podcasts. And then listen to some of the people who you normally disagree with, but on this issue, who you normally agree with, but who on this issue you disagree with. And just try to turn that around a little bit in your mind and remember that many issues are complicated, and try to see things through the eyes of people who you normally disagree with, and remember that they're human beings as well. It's not easy. There are times where I want to sort of pound my fist on the table, or more often just stop reading people who I don't agree with because I think they're wrong and I think the stakes are important. For me, global warming is the biggest example of that. But I think we're much more likely to make progress in these things when we don't shy away from the disagreements, but also revel in the debates and remember that the people on the other side are human beings. There's even a chance that they're right and we're wrong.
Ramesh.
Well, I would like to be able to model civil disagreement, but unfortunately I agree with everything that David said. So,
we'll get there.
So I'm just going to have to find an uncivil way to agree with him or something. Or maybe we'll be united against you when the vicious questioning comes. Thank you for having me. Thank you all for being here this evening. Is it evening? My time zone's a little mixed up.
Night for us,
yes.
Afternoon here.
Yeah. So I do think that one of the consequences of political polarization in our time has been that we are not as good as we used to be at understanding the other side of an argument. We don't have as good a sense as we once did of what millions of our fellow citizens believe. And in the absence of that understanding, we project onto them an uncharitable understanding of what they must believe. This is, I think, in large part a consequence of the fact that fewer of us live in neighborhoods and counties and even states that are politically mixed, that we are now much more politically polarized in a very geographic sense. And then it's compounded by media polarization, that conservatives are more likely to watch Fox News and even read National Review, although not enough of you do, and liberals to watch MSNBC or CNN, read the New York Times, that we're not in that kind of conversation with one another. I think the media has some responsibilities here, but I also think that it is on the citizenry to reward the media that are doing a good job of this and to stop providing an economic incentive for people to distort one another and to only present us with the caricature of each other's positions. I think the beginning of wisdom in all of this is to understand that every one of the major controverted political issues of our time have people who are intelligent and have goodwill on both sides of them, or 3 or 4 sides if it's the kind of issue that lends itself to having multiple sides. We have to exercise charity with one another in order to get to a point of civility. That doesn't mean that we can't have passionate points of view. And our understanding of what intelligent people of goodwill can support changes over time. So I would say in the 1950s, an intelligent American of goodwill could have supported segregation. That is no longer the case, right? That is a mark of societal progress that at this point, taking that view would be a mark of a vicious character. But I think we have to exercise a great deal of tolerance, and when we can, or on the side of imputing to somebody good faith. And one of the other things, and here I completely agree with David, we've got to look for the best examples of arguments on the other side. We've got to read, if we're liberals, we've got to read conservatives. If we're conservatives, we've got to listen to liberals. And it's not just because, as he suggests, sometimes you'll change your mind, but also I think it's just better to be able to understand the best arguments on the other side rather than the worst, or rather than just sort of trying to invent sort of arguments that you can knock down for the other side. That is part of having an intelligent and sensible position, but it's also part of understanding your fellow Americans, understanding the country that we live in, and that we're all in different ways trying to make better.
Can I add one point about that? So
I'm supposed to civilly disagree with you?
Yes.
Go right ahead. Yeah.
So I think a fair number of people in politics did high school or college debate. I did not. Did you do high school or college debate?
I did a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. So I did not. But Ted Cruz did it. Elizabeth Warren did it. I was talking to Jake Sullivan, who was a relatively senior foreign policy advisor in the Obama administration, about debate and what was good about it. And I said, it seems to me it's really good because when you do debate, you don't know, most forms of high school debate, which side you're going to be assigned. It's a coin flip often or some other way. At many tournaments, you must argue both sides over the course of the tournament. So you have to prepare both sides of the argument. And I said to Jake Sullivan, what seems good to me about that is that you learn you learn the weaknesses in your own side's argument. And he said, no. You learn that the other side actually has good points. And that's different. It's not just that you're right, but you might have some weaknesses. It's that the other side can make some legitimately good points. So.
Thank you, both of you, for that. I wanted to follow up by asking you about the kinds of experiences you've had in major media. David moving from, in effect, a reporter role for a major national institution to the opinion side. Ramesh, it seems you've always worked on the opinion side, but you have worked recently, not only writing for National Review, but for Bloomberg, which is a major news organization. So my question to you is whether it's healthy or not so healthy to have what I think is appearing, so you might disagree with me, that we have major media organizations more clearly affiliating with the left side of the spectrum or the right side of the spectrum. Not just opinion journals or the opinion part, but major news or organizations that call themselves news organizations being clear, more open, transparent in their partisan leanings. And one view of it, when Alexis de Tocqueville came here in the 1830s, he thought it was just astounding the number of newspapers in America, and they were all very clear in their partisan leanings, and he thought in a way that was fine. It was sort of part of the vitality, democratic energy of America. But there is another view which says, well, news organizations should separate their opinion page from their news, daily news activity. So what do you think about that? Which side do you think might be better?
So it seems to me that neither model of journalism has to be the right one for all times and places. A lot of our thinking about what journalism should be and about what other institutions should be like is affected by the middle of the 20th century, which was in many ways an unusual period in American history. We have had, as in de Tocqueville's time, an openly ideological press, and a lively press with a lot of back and forth and argument, sometimes conducted at a high level, sometimes conducted at a low level. Look also at the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists in the 1780s. I would say that we came up with this sort of a big media model that was attempting to appeal to everybody and not alienate people who were on the left or people on the right. For some economic reasons. And the problem now is that we do not have, in a lot of parts of journalism, a sustainable economic model, whether it's non-ideological or ideological, that rewards accuracy, fairness, and quality. It seems to me that the important thing is that we come up with that model more than that it's be a publication or set of publications or outlets that hold themselves out as objective, or whether they're ones that say, no, look, we're conservative, we're liberal, we see things through that point of view, you know that when you get us, but we're going to do our best to give you as accurate a picture as we can.
So as Ramesh said, there were economic reasons that the United States has this modern tradition of objective, just the facts journalism. Essentially, you have a series of local monopolies, and sometimes they were duopolies, but basically many cities ended up with one or two papers. They wanted to appeal to everyone, and so that's part of why they did this sort of straight down the center approach. That is not the historical norm, that's the historical exception. De Tocqueville pointed out in the 17th and the 18th centuries, most newspapers in this country were clearly ideological. If you travel around, you can still find newspapers that have Democrat or Republican in their name. If you go to London, you can read the Times on the right, the Guardian on the left, the same thing in France. So it's not like, oh, this notion of what we all think of as normal. That's actually not normal. It's a system that we had. Now, it does have some real strengths. I am actually fairly optimistic that on a national level, we do have a version of what you said, which is we have a set of publications who go out and attempt to collect facts and information in an objective way and then sell that information. The Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post all have very good businesses doing that. Connected to that, they all have pundits, right? People who to give their opinions, as I now do. It's interesting to me that all of them, although obviously the balance is different at them, all of them have both the right and the left. Right? I mean, the New York Times employs 3 conservatives. We get outside pieces from conservatives all the time, including Ramesh. The Washington Post arguably goes even further in that direction. They've really bent over backwards to hire pro-Trump writers. The Wall Street Journal goes less far, I think, but they have one center-left person who's a regular contributor, and they frequently get outside op-eds from people like Jason Furman. And so I think on a national basis, actually, we still have a version of that. My deep fear is on the local level. We have seen this incredible withering of the number of local journalists, and I think that really leads to a society that functions less well. I mean, there have even been academic studies that have found increases in corruption to the extent that it's measurable when local newspapers and radio stations close. And you just have many fewer journalists who are covering state legislatures and boards of education and city councils and major local employers and major universities and healthcare centers, and that's what I worry about. I am actually highly optimistic. I think the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post will all be around and strong 30 years from now. If any of them are not, I'm confident that something else will have risen and knocked them out and do that on a national basis. But I despair about the quality of the situation for local journalist economics. I hope entrepreneurs are trying to get it done. I am glad that Arizona State is funding a fair amount of local student journalism. I hope other philanthropies will do it. And I apologize for the really long answer, but as your introduction mentioned, I spent a year thinking about these issues for the Times, so I'm passionate about them.
Yes. I did want to mention, so Arizona State, just this year, I believe, I just came from a faculty meeting. They are, through the Arizona State University Library, paying for subscription for all faculty, staff, students to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. So it's not every national publication. I have not talked to the library leadership and who made that decision. It does partly address your point, David, that it's national.
Yeah.
So they're not subscribing to some local institutions, but there is the Cronkite School, and there are other ways of. So if universities, for example, could talk more about civic education and being intelligent consumers, even of opinion media that was of a higher quality rather than a lower, lesser quality, that might be helpful. A role for education, for example, is that you would agree with that? That educational institutions have a role preparing students to be consumers of media in intelligent ways.
I also think they have a supply role, which is I really do think local universities should be thinking about the decline of local journalism, which really, journalism is just a fancy name for information, right? And that's what universities are in the business of. And I think universities should be thinking about this problem of the decline of high quality local information and trying to address it in some ways. I don't have the answers for how they should address it, but in some ways, I agree we want demand, we want students who are good consumers, and you should be encouraging people, but I think you also have to help on the supply side.
So to get back to the point I was making about economics, the disappearance of local news, that's an economic story fundamentally. It's not, I think, fundamentally a story about our left-right polarization. It's a story about Facebook and Craigslist taking away some of the financial bases for these newspapers to survive. And that's the problem that they have to tackle. The economic, so in my opening remarks, I was talking about how there's this reward for polarization, there's this reward for hating each other, but the other problem that's part and parcel of this is there's also the shiny object problem, that we go chasing after each and everything to get clicks, whether or not they're important. And I do think a lot of journalism, including national journalism, has gotten worse at conveying what matters and what doesn't. I think in particular this has been a problem in this era. So we might have a day or two cycle of outrage about, Melania Trump wearing a jacket that says, "I don't care, do you?" Okay, fine, you want to have a little discussion of that. It's not quite on par with children being torn apart from their parents at the border, right? I mean, and there is a certain way in which particularly TV news sort of makes everything seem just as important as everything else, which means everything's unimportant.
I'll give an example of that in a way that is both dangerous, but ultimately is part of my confidence and optimism about a few national media. So I haven't checked this, but I am pretty sure the 4 or 5 most read things that I have written in the last, well, we can do the math, 2 years and 9 months, are all versions of Donald Trump as bad, right? I've done a list of the 40 most outrageous things he's done as president. I've done a list of the lies he's told. I've done a list of the things that he said that are racist. I believe all those things, which is why I wrote them. But again, they are the most read things that I have done. Thank goodness the New York Times does not have a business model in which we are mostly relying on selling ads against clicks. Because if we did, I am sure that I would receive pressure, maybe unstated, to do a lot more of those pieces. Now, there's still sort of incentives to do those pieces, right? It's nice to have the piece that's the most read piece of the month in the New York Times. So I'm not saying that we're completely immune for them. But at a certain point, writing those pieces are boring, right? That's why I've only written 4 or 5 of them over the last 3 years. I would rather write pieces also mostly about higher education policy, about tax policy. The reason I'm able to mostly say, it's fine, I'll do that once in a while when I actually have an idea that I think distills something and says something new, I'll do it. But I'm not going to do it all the time because we have a subscription business model. And our subscribers mostly aren't paying for that. They're paying to learn new things, right? They're paying, I don't do this, but they're paying to have people on the ground in Afghanistan. They're paying to have data visualizations that they wouldn't find anywhere else. And that's an example of what Ramesh is saying, that there are a lot of bad incentives out there in media, and one way for consumers to push back against them is subscribe to something that you think is worth your money, whether it's National Review or the New York Times or something local.
Or both.
Or both. And then I will tell you something else. Send maybe once a year, or do it twice a year. Send a note to someone who works there when you see something you like, and send a note when you see something you don't like. So subscribe, buy in, but then also tell them when they have disappointed you, or even when they've just done something you disagree with. Engage with that publication. I think that's part of civic discourse. Hold the media accountable.
So in my experience, people don't need to be encouraged to tell you when they dislike.
But don't you think they sometimes...
It's more the other one that...
But it's... So I'm not saying write a note saying, you idiot, right? We get enough of those, right? But write a note saying, hey, I normally think you're thoughtful. I disagree with you, but normally think you're thoughtful. This article, I just think you missed the mark, and here's why. I actually appreciate that.
The business model problem, have you seen any, I was mentioning to David earlier, Jill Abramson, the former editor of the New York Times, wrote a book about the extraordinary economic change in the past 20 years, maybe 25 years, of subscription revenue, of readership measured in different ways. So is there any positive sign out there about business models that encourage serious journalism and higher level opinion journalism that are beginning to turn things around? Because many very established successful institutions have withered and died or are struggling. So are there any good news stories about citizens wanting to reward what you would each think is higher quality news and information gathering and higher quality opinion journalism?
So I think the good news is that there are. The bad news is that David's already mentioned all of them. No, so I just think that this is still, we're still trying to find useful models, and the nonprofit foundation that is promoting journalism, or the journalism that is attached to a university, one of these sorts of models may make sense. I don't know if anybody's really found the formula for reviving what has been dying. I do think it is still the case that journalism is the only declining industry in our country that isn't part of Trump's political base.
Interesting.
There's lots of good news for your question at the New York Times. I mean, when we publish 10,000-word pieces in our magazine on major questions, huge numbers of people read them, and they spend a lot of time with them. We can see how long. They spend much more time with those pieces than my lists about Trump, right? So, and not just that, but we notice when we do something that has taken a lot of time and that resonates with people, people spend a lot of time on it, right? If you write something that's 5,000 words, they don't automatically spend more time on it than something that's 800 words. But if you write something that seems to work that's 5,000 words, people spend a lot more time with it. There's all kinds of evidence that people reward quality. But again, we're talking about a relatively narrow part of a national market, and we need models that aren't just, as Ramesh said, the places we've already mentioned.
Yeah, one other thing though, it is true that a small number of people can make a big difference. Think about book sales, how little it takes really as a percentage of the population to make a best-selling book. If you sold 1 million books, that would be an unbelievable success. And it's still 1 out of 330 people in our country.
Yeah, I mean, bestsellers are way below 1 million, right?
Yeah,
right. Are there generational differences as each of you think about your own writing, think about the institutions for which you write? Is there any good news about younger citizens, younger readers, rediscovering the value of what has been called legacy media, long-form journalism, the kind of 10,000-word stories or very high-quality opinion essays? Is there any good news there about younger citizens finding this is valuable and they're willing to pay for it? Or
absolutely. I mean, look, at this point I should say the New York Times still has business challenges, right? The loss of advertising. The fundamental media challenge is that display advertising for magazines and for newspapers, and sort of broadcast advertising and TV is the same thing, was this massive pot of money, and it's gone, right? I mean, that's a slight exaggeration, but it's not much. The revenue that the revenue that newspapers and magazines got from print advertising is not, it's disappearing, and it's not being made up by digital advertising, because all net new digital advertising is going to Google and Facebook, all of it. It's not going to the Arizona Republic. It's not, we're getting a tiny bit, which actually is important to us, but so that's really the bad news. But in terms of the audience, yes, the young people, they're not reading our print newspaper for the most part. But yeah, they're going online, and absolutely, they're part of the people reading the 10,000-word pieces, and absolutely.
One last question, and then we will get ready for the audience. This one, a little bit of an edge on this one.
Good.
In our liberal democracy, in Britain, in other European liberal democracies, the past 5 years, maybe a little longer, have seen what has been described as a populist reaction against various elites. Governing elites, both non-elected, judicial elites, elected elites. But I wonder if important national media in those European and British case, and in our case in America, is part of that, and accepting that premise, which you may not accept, how well have major national media done with understanding the phenomenon of Donald Trump, but also the phenomenon of Bernie Sanders, right? Two candidates in 2016, neither of whom was a long-standing member of the party in which they chose to run for president. So outsiders. And although Senator Sanders didn't win that primary, he had quite a lot of energy and had a fighting chance for a long time. And then the complete outsider did win in the Republican primary, and then won the national election. So how well would you assess your own media institutions, other national media institutions, in understanding the root causes? Or, here's the edge, or did many members of the national elite media react as elites and just were uncomprehending, and perhaps offended by both the Sanders phenomena, but especially by the even angrier Trump phenomenon?
Well,
we foresaw Trump, but you guys missed it, so you should go first.
Paul, I have a 10-part answer to that question.
10-part answer, good.
I think that it's been a disorienting time, a transitional time, and the media, and very much including myself, have not always been on top of things, but neither of the politicians, neither has Wall Street. It's just an unsettled time that we need to figure out. I think an interesting characteristic of this populist moment that we seem to be in, at least classically, I think of populism as being a critique of elites that are too powerful and are oppressing the average person or the little guy. Whereas I think today's populism and Trumpian populism is a little bit different because it's basically a critique of our elites being weak, not too strong. Our elites being sort of feckless, foolish, lacking kind of self-confidence and not being able to get anything done. And I think that's a critique that has been that's been difficult for various elites to respond to. And I think in particular, journalistic elites have had a problem with the way President Trump effectively uses them as a foil to cement his own support base to him by making them the enemy. And that's something that he couldn't have done sort of all by himself, right? It required a degree of conservative alienation from the press that I think maybe the press should be doing a little bit more reflection about the origin of.
David?
I have a lot of sympathy for the populism, even though it often takes forms that I don't like. I mean, if you look at virtually any measure of standard of living in this country for most people, it has grown extremely slowly, if at all, over the last few decades. So you look at income growth in this country for all but the top 5%, and it has been extremely slow for several decades. Median net worth in this country, the net worth of the typical household, is still lower than it was when the century began. If you look at all kinds of measures of social well-being, things like the obesity rate, things like the number of kids who grow up with one parent instead of two. There are some good signs, like crime has fallen, and that's a big deal. Abortion has fallen. But for the most part, most of the metrics are really quite bad. The economic metrics are particularly bad. And in the last few years, we have had actual average life expectancy in this country has declined, which is a shocking trend in a society that is advanced as ours. Even as the economy grows, most people get relatively little of that growth, and it filters down even less to things like health and well-being. So I absolutely understand the populism, and I do think the media has missed some of that, right? Most of us in this room, in the media, are doing better than the trends I just described, right? We are on the happy side of many trends. Not everyone, but most of us are. And so, yes, I think we missed some of the forces that have led to the anger. The only thing I would add to that is it's not just the media, right?
Totally true.
Trump's campaign thought it was going to lose. Hillary's campaign thought Trump was going to lose. Huge numbers of people thought Trump was going to lose.
All of Jill Stein's voters thought Trump.
All of Jill Stein's voters. Barack Obama thought Trump was going to lose, which is why he didn't scream more about the Russia stuff. James Comey thought Trump was going to lose, which is why he did what he did. I mean, it's again and again. And so, yes, the media, we did not do a good enough job of covering the 2016 campaign. I'm happy to get into more specifics. Some of it's really wonky. We didn't do a good enough job of telling people that things with a 15% chance of happening happen all the time, right? Like if a batter gets up in a baseball game and hits an extra base hit, you don't say, that's not supposed to happen, right? You say, that happens, right? Well, that's sort of what Trump's election was. It happens. But I just think it's important to say that both the frustration that people feel with the media is similar to the frustration they feel with big business, with Congress, with unions, with organized religion, with essentially every major social institution in our country, with the notable exception of the military.
Yes.
And I think the reason for that is this stagnation in living standards. People are right to be angry, even if their anger takes a form that I often wish it did not.
Let me just add one more thing on that. If you think about the opioid crisis, there's been a lot of great journalism about it. But it also seems to me that we have now, for several years running, had more people in America die of opioids each year than died in the entirety of the Vietnam War. And I think that a lot of institutions, including the media, were slow to pick up on that. And maybe even today are not quite covering it as given the fact that I just told you.
I agree. There's one other institution which has now become affected by this kind of polarization or distrust of elites, which is in the past 5 years, even higher education. It has become something of a partisan issue. And so I just want to press a little bit more on of all of the national media organizations, almost all of them reacted to the Trump election, not just to say, well, we missed the probabilities, but they are still mostly of the view that this was a horrible national mistake, that this person is holding this office, and the focus is, let's say many national institutions could be called part of the resistance. So that's a perception in polling in the media that the general public has about major national news media. Is that an unfair perception? Is there some ground for that
I will
perception?
tell you that my colleagues on the news side, who I don't work with, but I work near, and I'm sure the same is true at the Wall Street Journal, at the Washington Post. They would absolutely reject that, and they work very hard. I'm not saying they're perfect, but they really work very hard to cover this White House the same way they've covered other White Houses. And you often see people on the left get very mad at the way that mainstream news organizations cover this White House. I would even go further and say I sometimes think people in the mainstream news haven't yet figured out how to deal with just how different this administration is. So they're not perfect, but I think the people who are straight news reporters are trying very hard in a very difficult situation. I actually think they are doing better in this very difficult situation than mainstream news organizations do covering cultural issues like religion and abortion and guns, where I do think there's more of a problem with bias. I really think they're trying very hard and mostly getting it right on Trump.
Ramesh, you said something, though, about the president, just the kind of totally unconventional figure he is, keying in on ways in which he can manipulate media coverage or caricature the national media. Could you say a little bit more about that?
So I think there is such a thing as media bias. I don't believe that there are more than a handful, maybe, of reporters at the national networks or major newspapers who are consciously trying to, serve the resistance. But I just think that elite journalism tends to draw a more center-left crowd of people who work there, and that their work product reflects their assumptions about what's a story and what's not a story, who's credible, who's not credible, who are the white hats and who are the black hats in any particular story. It's not a question of having ill intent. I think it's people who don't see their own biases in the same way that fish don't know that they're wet. And I think that what President Trump has done, and a lot of his supporters have done, has taken this truth and used it as an all-purpose shield against any kind of criticism or any story that is unflattering. You just say, well, it's all fake. And if there's an actual inaccuracy in a story, then you're going to trumpet that to the skies and use it to discredit all the true stories that happen to be inconvenient for you. So far, it is a tactic that, again, it doesn't seem to be working with the public at large, in the sense that more people say they trust the news than say they trust the president to be accurate and honest. But it's been successful enough that a lot of his supporters are just not willing to listen to some of the criticisms.
Can I ask one thing about that?
Yeah.
So I agree with you, as I tried to imply, that liberal bias is an issue, right? It's certainly the case.
And particularly on the issues you mentioned, guns and abortion and so forth.
Yeah, and it's like objectively the case. Pew studied it at one point, right? And we were talking about newspapers in large cities that are mostly progressive, liberal, democratic, whatever you want to say. It's just objectively the case that there are more liberal journalists than conservatives, right? By probably a wide margin.
When Malcolm Gladwell was at the Washington Post, he said that we had to have a strict rule that reporters were not allowed to participate in the March for Choice because somebody had to stay at the news desk.
Yes, right. Yeah, exactly. So I guess what I would say is I don't think that's the only form of bias that matters, and I actually think we sometimes ignore the other forms. So journalists also have a bias for conflict, sometimes over import. And I think journalists inflated the importance of the hacked emails, the John Podesta emails. And to me, you may disagree, but to me that was a case in which the bias that was kicking in was not, ooh, we want Hillary to win. It was, ooh, emails, right? And so there were all these stories about John Podesta's emails, right? I also think there's a higher income bias, at least in national media. So I agree liberal bias is an issue. I think there are other issues. Sometimes those issues exacerbate liberal bias, and sometimes they actually go in the other direction. You think that's fair?
Yeah, I do think that's fair. And I think, I mean, like one of the ways that this is working, the hidden story that you uncover is news. It's exciting. In a way that the president going on the South Lawn and saying, I want China to investigate the Bidens, isn't quite the same as a story because he's just saying it. And like objectively, it ought to be as important as this thing that you've figured out with this classic sort of skullduggery and whistleblowers and so forth. But it just isn't. That's just not the way journalists have been primed to react and cover things.
Yeah.
Great. So we will pause for a minute and set up the microphone in the center aisle. People who've been with us before know about this part of the program. We've got a healthy chunk of time here. Good. We have some of our regular students. So we do have a sort of unwritten rule that we try and let some students begin the questioning. For our guests, the basic idea is brief questions, which should be brief and should be formed as a question. So our first questioner. Right into the microphone if you can. Right, Corbin, wait just a second. Let's make sure, is it on or?
I don't think it's you. I think it's the mic.
All this talk of civility, nobody's even shouting. It's terrible.
I think we're going to get a substitute mic coming up. I wanted to ask you both about electioneering. You made an interesting remark about journalists perhaps being disposed toward conflict.
Yes.
And the horse race quality. It seems to me, for example, your story about Teddy Kennedy, right? A great compromiser. That there's less attention paid to legislators who broker compromises and figure out how to actually pass budgets and pass legislation, and rather we spend more time, might be totally unfair on my part, in focusing on the legislators or partisan people who denounce the other side.
Yeah.
Very clear.
I guess I think the issue there is more Congress. I think Congress has I think the lack of horse trading is just in reality. There's less of it than there used to be.
So and that's other structural parts of our primary elections and fear that you'll be penalized if you compromise. And
look, some of it's not even all bad, right? In the 1950s and 60s, we had these weird political parties that didn't even represent necessarily someone's ideology. It's like you say you're a Democrat, what does that mean? Well, if you're from the South, it means you're really conservative, and if from the North, it means you're liberal. And our parties have kind of sorted, but it has this side effect that's not so great.
Right. Are we still? What now? Yeah, should I? Okay. Yeah.
All right, then.
Do you want to ask and we can repeat? No. Okay, great. We'll wait.
So, I'm happy to fill time until we get a mic.
No. But on the is there no media role there in rewarding
the work horses as opposed to the show horses?
Both journalists on the news side and journalists on the opinion side rewarding the kind of coverage that focuses on the champion of one side or another of an issue rather than covering and rewarding the people who will try to craft compromises on very complicated national policy issues.
I don't know about you. I mean, I enjoy doing policy journalism where I dive into
Love it.
Some issues. Those do not tend to be my most read pieces.
Correct.
So,
correct.
And maybe it's partly I have not made these issues sufficiently interesting, but there's also, I think, just a level of demand that can't be increased that much.
You'd hear that from every journalist. So we can't. It can't be that we all.
Yeah, that we're all bad at
it. Right. I mean, so there's just more interest in the other stuff. I think there's a bias in journalism towards centrism, at the expense of the right and the left. I think we often want to believe that whoever's in the middle is necessarily somehow wiser because they've incorporated the views of the right and the left. No, sometimes one side's just right. Like, you know, conservatives were right about communism, right? Liberals are right about climate change, in my view. You know, so I actually think there's a little bit more of a bias toward this notion that truth is always in between the poles.
Okay, so what are we going to try and do? I'm going to repeat. Okay, you project, and then I'll repeat the question. So make it brief, Corbin.
Yes, well, fortunately, I'm a communications major, so I have the information out there. This is more for David, and it's related to your point about the subscription model. I have kind of a pessimistic thought on that. There are journalists that are really like, I love reading broadly about the Washington Post, but I feel like I can't subscribe to the Washington Post because there's a lot in there that not only do I disagree with, but I also just find useless. How to remedy this subscription model that say makes maybe better to people that can't bring themselves to subscribe that way. They just really like one journalist, maybe just like one personality in there, and there's a lot.
So as citizens, but also as the media think about their business model, how do they deal with the fact that someone might like just a small portion of the total package and therefore they won't pay for the whole package?
Well, so if I could make a plea, if you find it useless, don't read it. But if you disagree with it, still read it. That's good, right? And, I think there are, first of all, the numbers suggest there are large numbers of people who do find the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times useful enough that they are willing to subscribe. I mean, the subscriber numbers have really been extremely encouraging. I mean, we now have more people reading the New York Times by a lot than have ever read it, and we have more journalists working for the New York Times than have ever worked there, right? So there is a market out there. But for people like you and in your relationship with the Washington Post, what I would say is I do think places are getting a little bit smarter about how to reach people like that. So I said advertising has gone away. I was exaggerating a little bit. So we have a bunch of people who write daily newsletters at the Times, right? I write one, my colleague Jamel Bowie writes one. Let's say that you think the New York Times is mediocre, but you think Jamel Bowie is fantastic. If you subscribe to Jamel Bowie's newsletter, you can do that for free. All of our newsletters are for free. It comes with advertising, right? And so there is a way in which basically we are monetizing in small ways, smaller, thin slices of the journalism. That isn't enough to support a business, but it's a nice add-on to the subscribers who are really the heart of the business. And I think you'll see more of that.
Okay, we might try the... Jonah, ready?
Yeah, I'll look more into those newsletters then.
Yeah.
Good, we have a live microphone for next question.
All right. So, my question is, what's the opinion of both of you on the new media outlets? You know, particularly those heavily click-driven and are a bit on the kind of lowbrow side, BuzzFeed, Breitbart, etc. And how do you think they will continue to shape the media and news landscape in the future as we march forward? Do you expect them to gain traction as we move forward, or do you think that it is possible that the country might start giving them these less reputable outlets the cold shoulder?
So I'll tell you the ones I dislike the most are the aggregators, the ones that just repackage work that somebody else actually developed to get sort of parasitical clicks. That I think is not something that is helpful to journalism. It's taking away the profits that should actually be going to the people who are producing the content. But, you know, just as there's room for left and right, there certainly has always been room for lowbrow and highbrow publications. And there are different kinds of consumers who like each kind of thing. New York, historically, this is a little bit back yesteryear, but they have tabloids to the left, tabloids to the right. The New York Times, you know, they were able to sustain a lot of different kinds of publications. And I hope that we figure out a way that we can do that again.
Yeah, I mean, the New York Times has never been the biggest newspaper in New York until now, right? So historically, lowbrow is a lot bigger than highbrow.
Is it bigger in New York?
Oh, that's a fair question. The New York Times may still not be the biggest newspaper in New York. That's totally fair. I would guess if you include web audience, it now is, but print circulation, it may not. Yeah.
Hi. I just want to say thank you, Mr. David Leonhardt, for your quote. Sometimes one side is just right. I hate to think that nowadays both sides are just trying to compete to see who can get more points on the board and things like that. But my question is, if you are on the opposing side, but you do understand the other side's point of views, perceptions, and do ultimately admit that they're right, how do you get the friends, family members, loved ones, people that agree with you, I guess necessarily, to not necessarily admit that as well, but be more tolerant, be more open-minded? How can we see that kind of culture and atmosphere within the news networks as well?
Within the news networks?
Yeah, that's overall. Yeah.
Within media organizations, maybe more generally, to have more tolerance for
instead of
opposing...
seeking who's right, just looking for the truth in general, no matter what side it's on.
It reminds me of two things. I mean, all the psychological research says that the way to persuade someone is not through facts, right? Don't barrage them with facts. It's to get someone they trust to try to persuade them, right? So it's, but that's sort of your question. So I actually think when you're talking about within a family or with a close friend, I think it's fine to try to put forth a barrage of facts, and sort of explain why you think what you think. I think more broadly, this idea of having...
That's why the Leonhardt Thanksgivings are always so much fun.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So I think, I do think that's a healthy thing. You also asked about the news. And I would like to see the news push a little harder to just say what's true and what's not, right? But I would also say recognize that most of these are hard calls, right? So, education's an issue where a lot of our right-left lines are a little bit scrambled, right? I'm fairly conservative on education. It's the thing when I write about that I get the nastiest comments from our readers. And so, for example, do you think it would be a form of ideology or truth to say that most attempts at education reform in major cities have shown progress? To me, that's truth. To many people, it's ideology. And so I think there are a lot of issues where when you want people to just say, come on, cut through on the one side, on the one hand, on the other hand, you then end up in a place where you actually think they're showing bias. And so while there are some issues where I think you do want them just to say the truth, I actually think there are more issues where there are two sides and it's really hard to sort them out.
I'll just toss in one thing. Sometimes when I'm speaking in front of audiences that don't share my general political assumptions, that are more liberal, often on college campuses, my goal is not to make people come around to my way of thinking. It's to make them think, well, okay, he's got a good point. He's a reasonable person. A reasonable person can think that. And if I get to that point, which I think I often do, and you're not going to get there with everybody, then I think I count that as a win.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elon Werman. I'm on the law faculty here at ASU. To frame my question, I want to take us back to, very quickly, I promise, Paul, to a time when civil discourse actually turned out to be impossible in America. And I mean, of course, the antebellum period, starting in the 1820s, but particularly the 1850s and 60s. It seems that civil discourse was impossible because disagreements weren't about ordinary politics. They were about something much more fundamental. The disagreement was over the very nature of the American regime and what it should be, its fundamental principles. You had one set of Americans who believed in the principles of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. They believed in self-government, and you had another who did not believe in that truth, who expressly disavowed, in the South, expressly disavowed their Southern forebears like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and disavowed this truth. And this was quite a fundamental disagreement, and so civil discourse, it seems, became impossible. So my question to you is, do you have reason to doubt whether today most Americans share a conception of the fundamental principles of our regime, or do they have disagreements about the fundamental nature of our regimes? For example, it seems plausible to say that one set of Americans believe our regime, although imperfect, is fundamentally rooted in the principles of self-government, ordered liberty, equality under law. And you have another who who do say that the regime is irrevocably and fundamentally insufficiently democratic because of its federalism features. It's fundamentally insufficiently illiberal because it doesn't protect enough rights. And quite the opposite of guaranteeing equality under law, they say it perpetuates structures of hierarchy and
So do we
inequality.
have regime-level conflict
So my
of
question
the sort
is, today,
yeah.
are our disagreements just about ordinary politics, or are they about something much more fundamental about the nature of the regime,
Okay,
and does that
good.
make civil discourse more difficult?
Simple question.
I don't think that we're in the 1850s. I think there are obviously some deep and passionate disagreements, but we have had periods of greater civil strife than we have right now. We had much more political violence in our country in the late 1960s and early 1970s than we have seen recently. But these are matters of degree, and I think that we are, we're more divided, and we have less in common than we did, say, 30 years ago, and that's something to guard against. I think the interesting thing, though, about the 1850s, 1860s comparison is we wouldn't have made it through. I think we wouldn't have been as well led if we didn't have somebody who had tried his best to prevent disunion, and who, even in the middle of this incredibly bloody civil war, was talking about how we had to reconcile with one another. So I think even if we have deep disagreements, maybe especially if we have deep disagreements, that's the time that we most need to have that voice of civility. And I guess the other thing I would just add to that is we shouldn't have too ideological a conception of what holds us together as a country, because it's very easy to say, what do California and Texas have in common these days? Maybe less than they used to, but Californians and Texans all think of themselves as Americans and think of each other as fellow Americans, and are not hung out about sort of first principles in quite that fashion.
I'm a little worried, but I agree with that, but I'm a little worried. I'm more worried than I expected to be about the state of our democracy. Although I think the people who are saying it's not democratic enough, let's worry about the fact that we have these elections where the popular vote loser wins. To me, they're not rejecting the system. They're trying to change the system the same way the suffragettes were trying to change the system and civil rights marchers were trying to change the system.
So the language about a cold civil war, or various phrases that use civil war, you think are hyperbolic or inaccurate. We're not at that level.
I mean, civil war is certainly hyperbolic, but I'm
Depends on how much weight you put on that cold part. I suppose.
yeah,
Cold part.
yeah. I'm worried about the state of our democracy.
I think we have our last question.
Good evening. Nice to see you. Enjoyed your discussion. My question is directly to the gentleman from National Review. I hope I misheard you, or I hope you misspoke. But did I hear you say that in the 1950s, someone of goodwill could support segregation?
Yes, you did hear me say that.
Okay.
I did say that.
Okay. Segregation was a dehumanizing system of thought and behavior. Segregation dehumanized black people. Segregation denied black people constitutional rights. Segregation denied black people educational opportunities. Segregation denied black people employment opportunities. Segregation denied black people voting rights. Segregation denied black people basic civil rights. Segregation dehumanized black people. Segregation gave social approval to the terrorizing of black people individually and collectively. In my mind, your statement is akin to saying it was people of goodwill could support Hitler and Nazism in the 1930s. I would like to respond to that.
So I agree with you completely on the evil of segregation. My point was that a lot of people who had been brought up in a culture where this was not questioned, where this was just the accepted way of doing things, who were basically good people, had to be educated, had their eyes open about those evils before we could make progress as a society. And I think it is a great sign of our progress that at this point, everybody of goodwill understands this. I just don't think that was the case, and I think that's how moral progress happens.
So what you're saying is that it was socially approvable. Racism was socially approvable. That is in essence what you said. Now, other black people, my family, we endured, okay, the effects of segregation. Okay, it's not an academic type thing. Okay, I think you should reconsider that line of thinking. I don't know what kind of circles you travel in, or how much exposure you have to black people. Okay, but very few black people would agree with what you said. And many would be very angry with you about what you said. Thank you.
So, sir, I also agreed with you about as Ramesh did, about your list of the evils of segregation. I think that's absolutely right. I think the thing that I find easier a little bit to think about, the point that you were making, because we've lived through it, is the changing views toward same-sex marriage in this country, right? And so that's an example of something that I believe in very deeply today. It's quite important to me, as it is for many Americans. It's personal. I can't fathom the idea of not being in favor of same-sex marriage today. I also recognize that there was a time in my own life in which I wasn't necessarily in favor of same-sex marriage. I would have said in college, yeah, civil union seems good, but marriage seems really far. And so I think it is possible to say that there was something that existed and that was evil, which I would describe segregation as evil, and also say that there were people of goodwill who supported it. And as you said earlier, to me that's an example of a society making progress. I am Jewish. I believe there are people of goodwill who have had deeply anti-Semitic views. I am deeply worried that some of those views are coming back into vogue. But I think on the whole, there are fewer people of goodwill who hold anti-Semitic views than did in the past.
I'm not buying your argument. I'm not buying your argument at all. Let me finish.
I respect your opportunity to disagree.
Let me finish.
We have one question behind you, sir.
I'm not buying your argument. And what you're saying, it just reinforces the concept that it's not the individuals that are involved, that it's a broader cultural problem. Okay? There's a racist cultural problem. Back then and today, thank you. I have my piece.
Okay, thank you.
And I agree with you that racism remains a systemic cultural problem in the United States today.
I just, a footnote, a group of faculty organized by faculty from the philosophy department and religious studies have formed a faculty reading group on the question of civil discourse and whether civil disagreement and civil discourse requires some shared moral capital, moral social capital, fundamental principles that are shared. And I was talking recently with a philosophy colleague about whether Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream address in 1963, in some ways echoing the Gettysburg Address, which we have in our pocket constitution, you should take one as you leave, whether that was a moment in which a non-elected figure from a minority community arguing for civil rights was appealing to enough of a shared moral capital so that he could be an agent for change. But the question related to one question back from Professor Werman, do we have enough shared moral capital to make progress on certain questions today, or are we even more divided than we were in the 1950s over? So anyway.
I actually think it's a reason for optimism that Martin Luther King was not the saint in life that he is remembered as today. Martin Luther King was hated by large numbers of Americans up until his death and after his death, and in a strange way.
It was certainly very controversial the last 4 or 5 years.
And his entire career, he had large numbers of Americans who hated him. And so he was not thought of as this sort of cross-partisan saint in life.
Yeah. Last question.
I don't think it came up in our discussion about public-funded media, but for me, our public-funded media are a really important way I get some of my news. How do the two of you feel about a model where the public does something to fund?
So some funding goes to national public radio,
right,
and public television, public corporation for public broadcasting. But we don't have the BBC, you're saying, is one, yeah.
Yeah, it just seems like a model that in our country can't be that large a part of our media landscape, that it would just inevitably become such a source of controversy about taxpayer funding of viewpoints that some people dislike, which isn't to say that it has, obviously there is a place for it, but I just think it's probably not going to be one that's much larger than it already is. Witness the concern people had when Mike Pence, as governor of Indiana, decided he wanted to start a state news agency, and I think you can see the start of the problem.
I think it's not ideal. I think the public media that we've got, I hope, would continue. PBS and NPR do fantastic work, but for the same reasons, I think it's not ideal. And to the extent that it's going to grow, and I recognize this is not a word that someone who's actually trying to have it grow would use, it's good to have the money be laundered. So I think it's easier for a university to get involved in media with taxpayer dollars than to have legislatures appropriating money for media, which I think is going to end up ending pretty badly.
And I assume Arizona PBS won't edit out any of that.
I was pro PBS.
Yes.
I am pro PBS.
Yes. Well, we have come to the end of our time. I have a few final remarks which stand between you and the reception outside, which we hope you will stay for. So I ask everyone to think about getting information on the way out, especially students who are here, about the courses in the school. And if you enjoyed this evening, to get the schedule of events coming up in the Civic Discourse Project generally, and in this year's theme, Citizenship and Civic Leadership. Our next event is October 30th. We have Raihan Salam, a journalist who now is the head of the Manhattan Institute, in a conversation with a sociology professor from Stanford University, Tomas Jimenez, talking about citizenship, immigration, and ideas of civic integration and assimilation. So that's October 30th. Thank you to my colleagues in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, our Associate Director, Adam Seagrave, and especially our events team and our public affairs team. So first, Dr. Carol McNamara, who is our Associate Director for Public Programs, Catherine Sheffield, who is our Special Events Manager, the rest of our team, Joe in Communications, JC, Bobby, Susan, Kim, our student workers, other people I've forgotten. An extraordinary amount of work goes on behind the scenes for events like this and for the whole series. So I now will ask for one more pause, and we will do one more PBS moment, which they call, if earlier it was the intro, this is now the outro. So if you just pause with me for a moment, and then we will have the reception afterward. Thank you all for participating in the Civic Discourse Project, which airs regularly on Arizona PBS. If you enjoyed the conversation in the evening, we hope you will listen to the school's podcast called Keeping It Civil, which you can find on iTunes and Podbean and any other place that you find podcasts. Both of tonight's speakers have been interviewed for the podcast and will be featured on it soon. So with that, on behalf of Arizona State University and my colleagues in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, we thank you and good night. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Unscripted.
So is there a choreographed exit? Do I have to go?